Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen in the room and online. Good evening, Chancellor. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford. My name is Janina Dill. I'm the Dame Louise Richardson Chair in Global Security here at the school. We come together tonight for the inaugural event of the Calleva-Airey Neave Global Security Seminar Series. Before handing over to one of the three co-conveners of the series to introduce the format, allow me to stress how pleased I am that the Blavatnik School is hosting this first event and that we are very honored that Lord Hague of Richmond, Chancellor of Oxford University, is speaking to us tonight. Here at the school, we have several active research programs that grapple with major security threats. The Oxford Institute for Ethics, Law and Armed Conflict, ELAC, leverages law, values, and institutions for the restraint of political violence and multiple wars across the world. The recently founded Oxford Programme for Cyber Technology and Policy, OXCTP, helps governments navigate challenges from emerging technologies, to name just two of our research programs. Right now, global security is under such constant and intense besiegement that it can be a challenge to step back and put dynamic threats into historical perspective. When every day, really every news cycle, throws up a new crisis that seemingly commands our immediate attention, to step back and draw connections among multiple crises, to gauge the dilemmas that they together create, and to try to articulate solutions based on consistent values, can itself be a formidable challenge. I'm therefore grateful to the conveners of the series that they have created this space to take this step back and think about the analytical and historical underpinnings of the manifold contemporary challenges to global security that we together face right now. I'm even more delighted that we'll be hearing tonight from Lord Hague. I cannot imagine anyone better placed to draw connections, gauge dilemmas, and articulate solutions from consistent values. And he will be speaking to us about these matters given the evolution of global security threats since the Cold War. So on behalf of the Blavatnik School of Government, welcome.
Janina, thank you so much for that incredibly kind introduction and for being such a fantastic host and partner here at the Blavatnik School of Government. And hello to you all here today. My name is Josh, and alongside Brianna and Julia, I'm one of the co-seminar leaders for the inaugural launch of the Calleva Global Security Seminar Series. And we could not be more delighted with how many of you there are here today and online, including friends and colleagues from the University of Oxford and beyond, but also practitioners and scholars and academics and journalists from right across the national security world, including from the Foreign Office, the Defence Academy, and from the College for National Security at the Cabinet Office. You are all so welcome at this series here today. But perhaps before we start, as we embark on this series through the next year, we should briefly try to attempt to broadly outline why we are all here. Why do we want to begin a new seminar series like this? Why now? What is the need? Why do we fundamentally think it's important? Simply, it's because we think the tectonic plates of global security have shifted, and the subsequent tremors and shocks have irrevocably changed the international order that we have enjoyed in the past decades. This risks sounding alarmist, but it is nonetheless true. A global pandemic, climate change, a major war in Europe and the Middle East, resurgent autocracies, the fragmented ideological landscape of extremism, the culture wars, and the acceleration of disruptive technologies have converged to create a polycrisis. Our alliances are at risk. Our economies and military-industrial complexes have eroded, and the unhealthy set of dependencies placed by the global order on the US security umbrella are at risk too, or at least forever changed. We are in the midst of an industrial and exponential evolutionary process which we should not assume favors the liberal international order. Francis Fukuyama's much misquoted history did not indeed end with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the world of the future may well increasingly look like the world of the past, with disparate regimes, monarchies, and technocracies vying for control. Every age faces challenge, but the international order has not faced an existential threat like this since the fall of the Berlin Wall. The wars of choice in Iraq and Afghanistan and the era of intervention appear to have exhausted the international will to bear the costs of global security and support a culture of international defense and security. The international order's sense of energy, purpose, and belief in its systems, its laws, its past, and its future appears to be shaken. If the magnitude of this challenge is not communicated, risen to, and met, then the world we know will change more rapidly for the worse than we are prepared for. This requires calm, objective analysis and rigorous scholarship, but it also requires a renewed sense of agency, energy, and dynamism. That is why, in our small contribution to this titanic paradigm shift, we are launching this Global Security Seminar Series, and we are bringing 3 research groups together to try and do this. From the Blavatnik School of Government, we have Dr. Brianna Rosen, Executive Director of the Oxford Programme for Cyber and Technology Policy, and a Senior Research Associate here at the school. Brianna is a seasoned national security professional who previously served on the National Security Council in the Obama White House. Then we have Dr. Julia Ebner, leader of the Violent Extremism Lab and postdoctoral researcher at the Calleva Center for Evolution and Human Science, a big supporter of this series. The Calleva Center for Evolution and Human Science is an interdisciplinary research center at Magdalen College, working to promote a deeper understanding of the origins, development, causes, and functions of human behavior and the grand challenges facing humanity. We also have the Airey Neave Trust, which I am representing, a research centre focused on international scholarship into the field of counterterrorism, established in honour of the soldier politician Airey Neave, an alumnus of Merton College, Oxford, a war hero, the first British escapee from Colditz, a lawyer at the Nuremberg trials, and later Conservative MP for Abingdon and top advisor to Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Airey Neave was assassinated in a car bomb at the House of Commons in 1979 by the terrorist organisation INLA, a splinter group of the Provisional IRA. We're honoured to have members of the Neave family here with us today. Together, these research groups have formed this seminar, and throughout the coming years, we will advance our belief in the importance of national security education and scholarship and inspiring the best minds and talent into policy and practitioner circles where they can have the biggest impact. Where better place to do this than Oxford? And who better to launch us into that process than our illustrious speaker today, the Right Honourable Lord Hague of Richmond, Chancellor of the University of Oxford. Lord Hague served for 26 years in the British House of Commons, serving in senior leadership roles, including at the House of Commons, lead of the Conservative Party between 1997 and 2001, and as First Secretary and Foreign Secretary from 2010 to 2014. Lord Hague now pursues a range of business and charitable activities and is a historical biographer, columnist at the Times, and chair of Hackler International Advisory Board. He is, of course, our very own Chancellor of the University of Oxford. We could not be more honoured to have Lord Hague inaugurating the Calleva-Neave Global Security Seminar Series and to have him share his reflections on a career in international affairs and his analysis of the evolution of global security since the Cold War. Lord Hague, thank you so much.
Well, Josh, thank you very much indeed. It's a great pleasure to be invited to give this inaugural seminar series, and I've already discovered 10 weeks or so into being Chancellor of the University that I get invited to an extraordinary range of engagements and events to speak on many subjects. I found myself only 6 days ago here speaking to at the conclusion of a conference on searching for extraterrestrial intelligent life in the universe. I said I had a lot in common with them because I'd spent 26 years looking for intelligent life in the British House of Commons. But I have more genuinely in common, of course, with people here today engaged in many aspects of foreign policy and international security. and I rashly agreed to give this opening contribution partly because of my very high regard for the Blavatnik School of Government, one of the best examples in the world at what it does, and also for Magdalen College and the Calleva Center there, my own undergraduate college, and the college of which I'm proud to be an honorary fellow, and also because because the Airey Neave Trust has sponsored and supported this. I actually knew Airey Neave. I am old enough to have known Airey Neave, to have known a man who escaped from Colditz and who advised Margaret Thatcher, and he gave me some very good advice when I was about 16 years old. He was murdered by terrorists when I was 18 years old, and I remember that terrible day all too well. But he was an extraordinary example of personal resilience and loyalty and steadfastness, and could teach us all a great deal about security and international affairs. So those were three good reasons for accepting to do this, and I'm very happy to give thoughts on those huge issues that Josh very well outlined. I'm not sure you need a lecturer, actually, because he stated it very well. And indeed, before I start, noting that the one defect of this magnificent building is that the clock is behind the speaker, and who therefore does not know how long he or she has been speaking for. I am going to put my watch there so that there's plenty of time for your questions. But I'm very pleased to do that. And I think to start from the point where I was Foreign Secretary for 4.5 years, and indeed Shadow Foreign Secretary for 5 years. So for nearly 10 years, I was responsible for the approach to international affairs of either the Conservative Party or the country, or both. And it was a very different world even that short time ago. Perhaps to use a story to start with, apologies to anybody who's already heard me tell this story before, but it's one that really illustrates how different international relations was in 2011 when I was Foreign Secretary. That was the first occasion I went to see President Putin, or Prime Minister Putin as he then was, at the Kremlin with our Prime Minister, David Cameron. And Putin, in all his body language and behavior, has to show how powerful he is. He is one of those people who has to exude power. And I remember the great double doors opening, about half an hour late, of course, because he has to be late to show you how powerful he is. And then flunkies open the great doors. And then he dismisses people almost at random, just to show how powerful he is. And then we sat at a small table. You were still allowed to breathe on him in those days. It wasn't a 5-meter long table. We sat at a small table. And then he had this big pile of briefing cards in front of him. And he kept throwing them away. More power, you see. You know, what's this? World peace? Throw this one away. Or consular cooperation? Throw this one away. But then he came to the card about gas. And he spent about an hour on gas. He wanted to sell us gas. Now, we were genuinely trying to improve relations with Russia. And it's important to remember that perspective, because sometimes we hear now that we provoked Putin, the West provoked Putin, that Ukraine provoked Putin. The President of the United States appears to believe that Ukraine started the war in 2022. And so it's important to be clear what huge efforts we made on the part of the United States at that time and the United Kingdom and many other Western countries to improve relations with Russia, to overlook many of the things that Putin had done, and to get on to a reasonable footing of mutual support for each other's interests, of more trade, of better contact between our educational institutions and citizens, and we were ready for that agenda. But Putin got onto the gas, and he knew that Germany had just signed up to Nord Stream 2, and he wanted Britain to sign up to a pipeline as well. And he drew the pipeline. One of my regrets of my time as Foreign Secretary is I did not save the napkin on which he drew the pipeline. This pipeline was going to come down from the Baltic. There was a little mark when it went under Denmark somehow that he did not define. And then it came across the North Sea, and he said to me, "It can come up in Yorkshire if you want." He had got it all worked out. Then he went through the price of the contract. We could have a reliable supplier for 10 years. They could be 5-year contracts. They could be 10, 20-year contracts. He was going to be our supplier of gas for the future. And that is Putin. What he wanted, his version of friendship is if he has leverage over you, you are his friend, because then you are required to be his friend. And that is the situation in which he managed to get much of Europe. And he ended up, one of the reasons he ended up attacking and invading Ukraine was because he could not get sufficient leverage over Ukraine to force them to do what he wanted them to do. And he wanted to get some leverage over Britain. David Cameron and I did not have this in our briefing folders at all, that he was going to do this, but I remember us looking at each other and just our eyes were saying, this would not be a good idea. Sometimes politicians make the right decisions just by not doing anything, just by inertia, just by refusing to agree to a new idea. And of course, we were not going to agree, despite all the energy problems that the UK had then and has now. We were not going to agree to put the United Kingdom in that situation. But this was a world only 14 years ago where the British Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary would go and sit down for long talks in the Kremlin, where we would make a real effort to improve relations with Russia, and where we believed that the rules-based international order would endure for a long time to come, and that Russia would somehow be accommodated in that, and we would manage to work together in that, and that China would have no option but to become more like us in its economy and even in its politics over time. That same year, I remember the very odd thing of meeting Xi Jinping on a bus, which not many people in the world can say. He was not yet the president of China, but I attended the 150th anniversary of the creation of Italy at great celebrations in Rome, and the Chinese representative was Xi Jinping of the Politburo. And I remember British diplomats saying to me, when you get on that VIP bus to go to the reviewing stand, you make sure you sit next to that man, because he might be the next president of China. And so I did. And we had the most unbelievably inconsequential conversation in which I tried to extract, like a good foreign secretary and a person who was overseeing MI6 and GCHQ at that time, to extract some nugget of information. But everything I said about, what a beautiful day it is in Rome, he would say, yes, the sun also rises in China, and things like that. That gave no clue. There was no clue. Of course there was no clue. So the fact that once he became president, the direction of China would change into a much tighter, disciplined party control over the economy and over many aspects of life in China, and that China would actually go in a more nationalistic direction, in the direction of one-man rule rather than the rotating decade of power that we had seen with several presidents before that. So this was still a time where we thought the rest of the world was going to become more like us. Sometimes this led us into error, such as in the so-called Arab Spring, where we were probably over-optimistic on many occasions about how easily democracy might be able to take root in parts of the Middle East. And sometimes we encouraged change and movement, such as in Syria, where we could not then fulfill their hopes and we could not help them to success, or even where they were successful, as in changing the regime in Egypt, they were soon overcome and changes were soon reversed. So there our idealism was already being proved wrong. But on the whole, we were working very well, very closely with the United States of America, of course, at that time. As Shadow Foreign Secretary, I conversed a lot with Secretary Condoleezza Rice, and all these people became long-term friends. I then worked as Foreign Secretary with Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State, and then John Kerry as Secretary of State. And we could more or less finish each other's sentences. US-UK policy was extremely closely aligned and well coordinated in the European Union as well. And this allowed the United Kingdom still to be a country that could sometimes move the dial in international affairs. Nothing like as powerful as the United States. But we were able to tackle some issues. And Britain still has a good degree of ability to do these things. The issue of piracy in the Indian Ocean was a prominent, difficult issue when I was Foreign Secretary. And we worked very closely with the European Union. This is just to give an example of how constructive foreign policy can work, because many things go wrong. We have to remember things can often go right. We worked, the United Kingdom could hold the pen at the United Nations Security Council, which we did, to write resolutions that supported setting up a legitimate government in Mogadishu. I visited there a couple of times. We then provided the naval headquarters at Northwood for an international naval task force to police the Indian Ocean and fight off the pirates. We then arranged through the European Union for the financing of African nations to put armies where necessary into that region to fight the terrorist organizations associated with the piracy, and we used our very generous development budget. We were hitting the target of 0.7% of GDP spent on overseas development assistance to ensure relief from some of the consequences of famine at that time. So the United Kingdom was able to put together at the UN and with the European Union and with close contacts with Commonwealth nations in East Africa and its military capabilities, a decisive political and financial and military solution that more or less eradicated the piracy in the Indian Ocean. So some things we were able to do successfully, and that thriving rules-based international order of the time, others much less successfully. Once the conflict got going in Syria, my biggest disappointment as Foreign Secretary was that we were not able to resolve that conflict despite many efforts to do so. It has gone on until very recently, of course. We worked again very closely with Russia to do that. But in the end, the Russians would not deliver the Assad regime into the bargain that we had all made together, that we would bring the various parties into successful peace talks. And that showed once again that the trust we had placed in Putin and his team was misplaced. But this was the world round about 2012, 2013, and perhaps we didn't fully, well, we certainly didn't fully understand that we were coming to the end of an important chapter in the history of international relations. Now, I wrote books about the 18th century, but I often think about if I was writing in another 100 years' time, where would we be in the chapters of our own history in the late 20th and early 21st century? And I think we are now getting fully into what I call Chapter 3 of the post-Second World War world. Now, what are these chapters? This is a simplistic way of thinking about it, but it helps us to organize our thoughts and understand the age we are now in. Chapter 1, to me, of the post-war history was the Cold War. From the 1940s to 1989, the Cold War dominated international relations, a very dangerous time, as we know from incidents such as crises such as the Cuban Missile Crisis, a very dangerous time. On the whole, quite a stable time, unless you were living in Vietnam or one or two other places that were being so bitterly fought over in the Cold War. A lot of progress was being made in the world, but our concerns were of nuclear exchange. I used to come and when I was president of the Oxford Union here in 1981, our big debate was about the campaign for nuclear disarmament. Those Cold War issues dominated much of the politics of the time. And then, of course, there was the great release from that with the fall of the Soviet Union. And we entered this marvelous Chapter 2 of our recent history. Most of the danger had gone, and great excitement came in its place. There were still many problems. We were to have 9/11. We were to have a global financial crisis. This brought the war, but wars of choice, as was someone just mentioned, in Iraq and a war in Afghanistan. But it did not bring a global crisis of international relations. It did not bring a polycrisis, another word that we've already heard tonight. We were really have been, those of us who lived through that period, one of the luckiest generations in the history of humanity for the times that we lived in, of great economic progress. Globalization seemed to be going on forever. Liberal democracy was triumphant, indeed the end of history. And that period lasted for a good 25 years, and we fell into the trap of thinking that it was the normal world. Actually, we were just going through a particularly pleasant period, apart from those one or two disasters that I just mentioned. We were going through a particularly settled period in geopolitics. And now I feel we have entered, and since 2015 have been entering chapter 3 of the post-war history. And where chapter 1 was headlined Danger, and chapter 2 was headlined Excitement, the thing about chapter 3 is it is very dangerous and very exciting at the same time. And this is a difficult thing for humans. This is a difficult thing for the way our brains have evolved, and it's a very difficult thing for nation states to cope with the combination of the world being more exciting than it has ever been, but more dangerous than it has ever been at least in our own lifetimes. And that excitement, of course, we can see so much of that excitement here in Oxford when you see the remarkable advances that take place almost every week in science of every kind, and in particular in medicine and in multiple technologies. We have the ability to improve, or on the edge of having the ability to transform human lives in a very positive way to a greater degree than any previous human beings ever in the history of civilization. But this has come with greater dangers, and to some extent the excitement and the danger are interlinked. And that is because the change in world affairs, this arrival in chapter 3, is in my view brought about by 5 great cycles of activity changing, cycles turning. Geopolitics goes in cycles. We often don't think of it in that regard, but if we look back long enough over history, you can see those cycles, periods where there might be a dominant power or a peace after an exhausting conflict. But then those powers that are threatened in that situation start to fight back. Xi Jinping came in and decided that the lesson of Gorbachev and the lesson of what happened to the Soviet Union was that China had to go in the opposite of a liberalizing direction. Putin decided that if all the neighboring states in Georgia and Ukraine and Moldova nearby became successful democracies, then actually a whole corrupt system of power in Russia would be threatened. And so it was necessary to start to fight back. The geopolitical cycle turned. At the same time as economic cycles were turning in many countries, leaving places that had long had successful industries at the mercy of new expanded world trade with cheaper production from other countries in the world that has then helped contributed to destabilizing the domestic politics of Western nations. But many other cycles coming along, a demographic cycle of quite exceptional speed and scale in human history, because most countries of the world now, certainly most European countries and many others, and across East Asia, populations are falling. But in Africa and the Middle East, we're still looking at a roughly doubling of the population over the next quarter of a century. And this, not surprisingly, creates a growing cycle of migration that places an immense strain on the domestic politics of many Western countries. And you can see that abundantly in the politics of the United States today, and indeed the politics of Germany. And here in Britain, probably Brexit would not have happened without the migration issue entering the voters' minds. Then we have a climate supercycle. There have always been changes periodically in the climate of the world, but not on such a scale, at such a speed, created largely by human activity, with rapidly growing consequences that will fuel that migration cycle further. And then a technology super cycle, the fastest period of change ever in history, that has now begun and particularly is accelerating with the arrival of artificial intelligence and will go even faster as quantum technologies come along, that is revolutionizing warfare and economies, but it will destabilize many societies and governments. So Tony Blair and I, in the papers we have written together, have described the arrival of AI as the greatest ever challenge for the modern state in terms of the opportunities that it presents, but also many of the dangers that it presents. So this is why we have a period that is both very exciting and very dangerous at the same time. And that will require us to think in a different way about how we develop ourselves as individuals or companies or universities or nations, and how foreign policy is conducted. It gives rise to a number of strong trends. I don't want to throw too many frameworks at you here because we've already got 3 chapters and 5 cycles, but I think there are unfortunately 10 trends that arise from this. So if you're taking notes, speed up. And this is number one. It's a more inflationary world with all the shocks to supply that happen in the world that I have just described. It's a world where energy flows are much more politicized and much more strategic. Nations take political action against each other by directing their energy flows or refusing to buy the energy of another country. Thirdly, it is a world in which critical minerals become very important in that technology super cycle and that climate cycle. As we try to adapt to that, we need many, many times the supplies of cobalt and nickel and rare earths and everything else. Fourthly, it's a world of much, much higher defense spending, whether we like that or not. Of course, we would have preferred to be without it. It is a world of much higher defense spending because of all the insecurity that this brings. Fifth, it's a world in which ESG becomes a more contested concept because more urgent things seem to take over. Sixth, it is a world of declining global governance. And here we have something very important to this discussion, which is that in this environment where the geopolitical cycle has turned, and now adding to that the United States has abandoned many of its traditional values and is questioning many of its traditional alliances under the Trump administration. In this environment, it becomes almost impossible to make the global agreements that would be necessary to stave off problems in the future. Cold War nuclear treaties are generally expiring or being abandoned. In a rational, cohesive world, we would now be making new agreements on the restriction of nuclear weapons, particularly as China is building up a huge nuclear arsenal. We would be signing new treaties to deconflict activities in space, since there is nothing has succeeded the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. We would be coming to agreements about the integration of AI with weapons systems on what are called lethal autonomous weapons. But on all these and much else, it is now impossible to make progress on global governance. And that is one of the reasons we are almost guaranteed to be in a lengthy chapter in Chapter 3, rather than just a very short chapter that's over in a few pages, I'm sorry to tell you, because the problems created by that lack of global agreement are going to hit us 5 and 10 years from now. Seventh trend is that in the light of that, there are more informal networks of nations cooperating regionally, and you can see them forming all the time, and you can see how the UK and European countries get closer together. And the current situation over Ukraine and the change in policy in the United States, the same, there are equivalents happening in many different forms around the world. Eighth, this is a world in which the decoupling of China and the United States becomes more serious and is very hard to reverse or arrest because of the strategic competition between them. Ninth, this is a world where resilience is much more important than it was before in that more happy, settled part of our lives. And 10th, it is a period of much more intensive state sponsorship of technology, because leadership in technology becomes critical to national security and not just to economic prosperity. And you can see that very, very dramatically around the world today. The war between Russia and Ukraine has brought intensive technological innovation. It's also shown that you still need mass in warfare between states, whether that is of men or artillery, or now, of course, of drones. Ukraine is set to produce more than 4 million drones this year, so nearly 100,000 drones a week, using many of those for purposes that we didn't imagine in warfare only 3 years ago. And look at Israel's operations, whatever we think of the right or wrong to them, just the military tactics of it in Gaza and in Lebanon in recent months, and you will see the devastating effect of combining quite well-known military arsenal with data analytics and AI, which enables, for instance, the total destruction of the leadership of Hezbollah in a matter of days, which is not something that Israel could have accomplished only a few years ago. So technology, access to technology, and the nexus between technology and defense has become absolutely critical. It's always been important. Why was Britain able to conquer an empire? Because it had the Industrial Revolution, because it led in technology. It wasn't because our soldiers or diplomats were more brilliant than anybody else's. Of course, there might have been some brilliant ones among them, but they had the technology. That was the critical advantage. So that's always been the case, but now it is accelerated. And to be 1 year ahead in integrating the software of the battlefield with the hardware of the battlefield is to be 50 years ahead in your ability to deliver lethal results. So this is a world where although we cannot predict day-to-day events very easily in such an uncertain world where all those cycles are operating, we don't know what President Trump will wake up tomorrow and say or decide or put out on Truth Social. We can see those trends clearly, and we can see the implications of those trends, and we can see how those trends are bad news on many of the geopolitical fault lines of the world. When I used to look at the globe as the Foreign Secretary, I used to think about geopolitics as having fault lines, just like we have the geological fault lines, whether it be the San Andreas Fault running down California or anything like that. So we have geopolitical fault lines on which most of the security earthquakes and volcanoes tend to occur. One of those runs down Eastern Europe, for reasons I was giving earlier, between Russia and democratic European nations. That, of course, has erupted in recent times with the Ukraine war. Perhaps in our questions and discussions we can explore the recent events about that. But what we have seen in recent weeks from the Trump administration is not, in my view, the way to go about reaching a sustainable end to the war in Ukraine. There is much too much emphasis on satisfying the Russian side, much too great a readiness in Washington to believe the Russian side, much too much susceptibility to flattery from Moscow, excessive blaming of the Ukrainian side, and a neglect of an important principle in international affairs, which is that you should not allow aggression to be significantly rewarded, or you are more likely to have aggression occur more frequently in the future. And this, of course, is creating it threatens to create a split in foreign policy between the United States on the one side and UK and other European countries on the other. I went to see someone at the Foreign Office. I had a discussion with someone at the Foreign Office a few weeks ago where they said, I think this may be the most important moment in international affairs since 9/11. And I said, no, I don't think so. It is the most important moment since 1941 in our alliances, because really since December 7th, 1941, and Pearl Harbor, and then 4 days later, Germany declaring war on the United States in the Second World War, there's been a very strong strategic, shared sense of strategic purpose between the United Kingdom and the United States that has only ever been broken on rare occasions, such as over Suez, and even then, the overall view of world affairs remained the same. But now this is a different view. And it is, someone asked me at a different event this morning, is the US approach under Trump just a transactional approach? You have to balance the trade with every country as if you're making a profit or loss from it. It's just transactional. You make a deal over something like Ukraine. And I said, well, it is transactional, but it is more than transactional. There is a different strategy and different set of values behind it, and we have to understand that. There is a strategy of focusing more on strategic competition with China, but that strategy is meant to include better relations with Russia, partly as an answer to partly to help with strategic competition with China, and it includes a stronger military presence in the Arctic and access to the minerals of the Arctic. So when you hear the President Trump say he's going to get Greenland and refer to so often to a Putin narrative in world affairs, it is in his mind part of a different strategy. This is not, in my view, a strategy that will succeed. I believe the Trump administration has misread China with its approach to tariffs. And China is in a stronger position in a trade war than the United States anticipated or the Trump administration took into account. I believe Russia will take the United States for a ride in letting it believe that it can improve relations with Russia, and Russia will stay very close to China for very important economic and strategic reasons. And I believe that any move against the continued bullying of Canada or continued hostility to Denmark over Greenland will severely weaken the Western alliance, thus making life easier for China and Russia at the same time. So this is really not a strategy that I would recommend. But it is one now that is being pursued in Washington, and a huge shock has hit London and other European capitals of the extent of this change. Only a few months ago in Davos, learned Americans were going around saying, take the president seriously, but not literally. And then it has become apparent since then that you have to take him seriously and literally. And that shock has set off what may become a very positive effect in international relations and security. The effect on many European countries, particularly in Germany, now contemplating vastly greater defense expenditure in the coming years. And of course, here in Britain, the government, more slowly, but the government here in Britain is changing its defense priorities. We, of course, await a very important defense review that is due out in the coming weeks. But that is one of the fault lines. Time doesn't allow me to go through all of the fault lines in world affairs, but clearly one of them runs along the Gulf and through Israel and the Palestinian territories. And on that, good work is going on in trying to achieve a new nuclear agreement with Iran, although that work is only necessary because of the abandonment of the previous nuclear agreement, which I was part of as the Foreign Secretary in 2013. But the lack of restraint from the new administration on Israel in Gaza, while the Israeli military are extraordinarily accomplished and effective in what they do, really leaves Israel with having to do that over and over again for generations to come without countenancing any political solution to the Israeli-Palestinian issue. A political solution is still needed. Then there is the fault line that runs down the South China Sea. That again is that could be the subject of a whole lecture in itself. But the mishandling of China and of international relations threatens to bring forward, I think, a crisis over Taiwan, not imminently, but in the coming years. And then there is a fourth fault line, which is that between Pakistan and India. And that has stirred, of course, with an appalling terrorist outrage in Kashmir in the last few days. And we have to hope that that fault line will not be opened up. So this is a world with those multiple fault lines endangered, in which those 5 cycles that I spoke of are turning, in which we're in that chapter 3 that is more exciting because of technological advance, but more dangerous because the geopolitical cycle has turned, and with it all these technological developments. And that means to me that the requirements of living in chapter 3 are greater resilience than we were used to in our happy chapter 2, but constant reinvention, because it means that technology is at the forefront of our security. We need, in this country, for instance, diversified energy supplies. That means you have to push forward with renewable energy, but it also means you have to get on, if we're going to do small modular reactors, you have to get on and do them and make a decision to do them. Resilience and reinvention are needed at the same time. For the United Kingdom, what this new age, new chapter means, I think, are several things. First of all, it is important to repair cooperation with the European Union, with European countries, even if it isn't always through the European Union, on defense and security. I always thought there should have been an agreement on that at the time of Brexit. The government here at the time didn't want that. Now there is really an appetite for that, and it will be important to build up a European pillar of NATO at the same time, and to deepen cooperation, given the doubts about the reliability of the United States in some crises that might occur, to deepen our cooperation with many other countries, including Australia and Canada and Japan in particular. Second, it means we have to have our own thriving defense and technology industry, and the government has recently committed hundreds of millions of pounds to support the defense industrial and technology base in the UK. Again, this is intimately linked with the defense review that is coming up, and we should be creating close partnerships with the people in Ukraine who have done so much on innovation. Third, it means we will have to have much more of a whole society approach to resilience and to defense and security. We are used to relying on small bunches of people to do that. Only a tiny fraction, I calculated this at about 1/3 of 1% of the adult population now have military skills. We rely on extraordinarily effective people in our armed forces and intelligence services for our protection. But this is a world in which the whole of society will have to be more committed in the way that it invests, in the way that taxpayers' money is used. I have advocated in the past, at the risk of angering, of course, my dear students here in Oxford, competitive national service on the Nordic model. But one way or another, we need the commitment, the wider commitment of society to defense and resilience. Fourth, we will need strong new attention to biosecurity in that exciting but dangerous world that I've described. Foremost among that is developments in biotech and bringing the information revolution together with the biological revolution. That brings us to the verge of extraordinary advances, as I've said, but it also brings us to great dangers in how terrorists could develop new weapons or how future pandemics could get out of control. So Tony Blair and I have a new paper being published on this in about 2 weeks' time, which I hope you will read. You'll notice it's one of the interesting features of my life recently, that having failed to destroy Tony Blair for many years, I've now teamed up with him in order to give advice to all our political parties. And it means for the UK that if the United States is to abandon some of its alliances or shared values or support for multilateral institutions, the UK will have to work with other nations to try to shore up those institutions and to keep them alive. And since we do need those global agreements on the issues that I mentioned in future years, some nations have to keep the hope and belief and groundwork for those alive for the future. So this is the world as I see it, the security world as I see it since the Cold War. Academics can make a tremendous, universities can make a huge contribution to this, as they always have. If we were trying to understand the Russian invasion of Ukraine 3 years ago, then you couldn't do better than read the papers by the Royal United Services Institute. I declare an interest. I'm a former chair of that and senior vice president of it. But their analysis of the military developments explained many things that seemed inexplicable, of how the Russian armed forces could not put together a combined arms operation on the scale that was required. Universities and academic analysis have a very important role in training for the future. The diplomats and specialists in this field of the future need to be able to learn in the world's best possible learning environments, and that includes here at Oxford. There's also a very important role in track 2 diplomacy. Even in the Cold War, a great deal was achieved by scientists working together between the United States and the Soviet Union. For instance, through the Pugwash process, which was jointly awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, the work of American and Russian and other scientists, even in those confrontational conditions of the Cold War, led to the Partial Test Ban Treaty and to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. There is a very important thinking role, policy-making, and academic role in supporting that, and we need some equivalence of that in the world that I am describing. And then there is the importance of bringing people together to think together, whether it be at things like the Munich Security Conference or in the work of Chatham House or RUSI, or here in St. Anthony's College and many other fora here in Oxford, and we should strongly support that because this is chapter 3 of the history of our times. You should be more excited than you've ever been, but you should be more aware of the danger than you have ever been. And we in Oxford and we in the United Kingdom have a big contribution to make to making sure that the excitements are fulfilled, but the dangers are averted, and it's going to be a great deal of work to do so. Thank you very much indeed for listening to me.
Thank you so much indeed for this very inspiring, thought-provoking, and also very insightful inaugurational seminar. I think it's been really quite a journey coming from your conversations, private conversations with Xi Jinping on a bus, to talking about the different chapters, and chapter 3 in particular, the 5 cycles and the 10 trends as you described them. I would like to open up the floor to questions. I also should say that we have some questions from our participants online, so I will read some of them out loud. And I would actually start with the first question here, while you can still think about your questions in the audience, but from an online guest. Actually, I'm really pleased to say that we have such a diverse audience also joining us online. We have a 17-year-old high school student from Switzerland, Liv McGeaney, who asked a question. You've already touched on some of it, but perhaps you could dive a bit deeper into how you would see the impact on the education sector, perhaps also looking specifically at what not just the universities, but also perhaps schools can provide in this very challenging environment where also it seems to be even on the minds of young people who've not yet started university, but who probably soon will.
Right. Well, I'm not going to write the whole curriculum, particularly in Switzerland, but it's a good question. It's absolutely the right question, and I think it is very important for education. You know, in my speech, my admission speech as Chancellor a couple of months ago, I spoke about the speed, not about the security challenges specifically, but about the speed at which the world is changing and the implications of that for universities. Of course, it means that we have to remain absolutely excellent, supporting that by welcoming people from every irrespective of brilliant people, irrespective of background. So remaining the very best in the world in our analysis and understanding of the world is going to be very important. But it also means, among many other things, academic freedom and freedom of speech, because when new situations arise in the world, we have to be able to discuss them openly without being prisoners of some orthodoxy. You know, we've all been prisoners of orthodoxies. In my chapter 2 of World Affairs, we really all thought the same thing about the triumph of liberal democracy and how we were going to sweep all before us. So actually, we have to encourage a greater diversity of thought. What is happening in the United States now in terms of threats to academic freedom is extremely serious and will be extremely damaging, I think, to the interests of the United States. Would be a great mistake. But it's a mistake to be prisoners of any particular way, of any fixed way of thinking. So that's important in education. And for students entering, for the 17-year-old student, you know, be aware that this is a world where resilience and reinvention are going to be very important. Those are the two words I keep coming back to. Compared to people who entered their education in 1992, you know, they could have more of a fixed career. They could be more sure that dramatic world events and crises would not interrupt their career. This is going to be a world where things get interrupted, where the plan you might have for your life doesn't work out because of those world events. And so being able to, having the skills to reinvent yourself and being used to being resilient in the face of adversity are going to be important qualities for organizations and for individuals. So that's probably enough advice for the moment.
Yeah, thank you so much. Should I take a question from here, from the room? Oh, okay, there's a lot of questions already. That's great. Perhaps you in the back row.
Hello. Hi. Thank you very much, Lord Hague. I would like to make reference to your comment about technology and defense. On a scale from 0 to 10, how do you feel the UK and Europe will be able to reach independence from the US regarding defense, of the independence to the defense systems and defense equipment? And on this fight about AI between Chinese and American companies, do you think Europe will ever achieve AI sovereignty? And we have UK and Europe will have a reply to that. Thank you.
Well, these are good things to aim for. We're a long way from both of them. I mean, the answer to your first question, on the scale of 1 to 10, depends on your time scale. Because if, you know, give it 50 years and you can get to 10. But it would take a long time. We are very heavily dependent on the United States for many aspects of not only of our defense broader, but of defense technology. You know, take the biggest example, that we are a brilliant country at making nuclear submarines. Very few countries in the world can do that. We have a whole town that does it up in hardly anybody ever goes there. It's the hardest place to get to in England from London, Barrow. They make nuclear submarines. They're brilliant at it. They're also very good at making nuclear warheads. We, however, cannot make the missile that submarine uses to fire that warhead. That has to be purchased from the United States. So we can have our independent nuclear deterrent. But it only works because we can buy very important parts of it. And that we can only buy from America. Now, you can replicate that then through many, many other defense systems. And I am sure that the UK government and other European governments will now be going down the list. If they're not going down the list, they ought to be, of, well, what are the things where we actually have a lot of abilities? We have the academic abilities. We have the, you know, the firms that are capable of it. And we can quickly reduce our dependence so that if there is a big division of opinion over Ukraine, you know, let us say if European countries have to carry the burden themselves of supporting Ukraine, that then the United States can't prevent them from doing so. So they do need to achieve some greater independence quite quickly. And you can see the efforts to do it. You could see reported a few days ago the announcement, if it is correct, by BAE Systems of setting up a new facility later this year to increase 16-fold their production of explosives, and to do so for the first time without needing components from the United States. And satellites is an obvious and very urgent and important example. Since satellites and the integration of their intelligence through advanced software with the physical reality on the battlefield are now of paramount importance in modern warfare. And that's why the work of firms like Palantir and indeed Starlink have been fundamental to the defense of Ukraine. Europe does have satellite companies, but not developed to that extent and on that scale and with those specialities. Of course, it is now going to set out to do so. And that is why I think the share prices of satellite companies based in Europe have gone up hundreds of percent in the last, just in the last couple of months. So there are some things that can be done quite quickly. There are other things that would take a generation, and therefore needs a quick, selective approach, and not in an atmosphere of hostility to the United States, because it will still be very important to work with them in multiple ways. But replace it, making sure we have the sovereign capability to do things, or sovereign with some small groups of other countries, is going to become more important. On your question about AI, autonomy in AI, well, this is, actually that's even harder at the moment than the nuclear weapons. Because of course, a lot of the fundamental development of generative AI has taken place here in the UK with DeepMind. But what happens to any, to most really successful startup British companies is they get bought by an American company pretty quickly. So they are now part of Google, and are still doing very well, and that no doubt is working out very well for America and for Britain. I don't want to criticize what they're doing, but it means having a sovereign capability is very difficult. Again, in the papers I've done with Tony Blair, we have strongly advocated this as a major area of investment for the UK, both public and private. And the AI growth plan, published in January, written by Matt Clifford, coincides with many of the things we've been saying for the last couple of years, including requiring a 20-fold increase in research compute capacity in the UK, and AI growth zones where planning is accelerated and energy links are available. The government has accepted that idea. In fact, the first one is to be at Culham in Oxfordshire. We need a lot more of that. We need that plan to be really fulfilled. And I think there will need to be, between Britain and European countries, some collaboration to encourage AI development, like Mistral in France, that has done pretty well from a standing start in the last few years. That it does give a choice from American and Chinese products. But that will require governments to see that as a strategic priority, to put some money behind it, encouraging the private sector. And I think they're not yet doing that on the necessary scale. So Europe is a long way from, it can now make progress. There's been this galvanizing shock to Europe of the last few months. But it maybe is just in the nick of time. It's at the last possible minute, because there's been talk of strategic autonomy for a long time. But if you bought your energy from Russia and relied for your growth on China and your security on the United States, you're a long way from autonomy. And that is the starting point of Europe, and now in this changed world.
Thank you so much. We have many, many questions, both online, but also
Sorry,
here in the
I'll
room.
try to give shorter answers.
No, it's great. And I will try to combine a few questions at once so we can take more questions. Perhaps a couple of combined questions from the online audience. I'll try to distill the essence of some of this, or combine some of them. One of the questions would be, how do you see, if you were now, and you mentioned this briefly, but looking back, say, in 100 years' time, looking back at this time now, how would you like to write the end of this chapter and the next chapter? What would be the ideal chapter from your perspective? There's someone who, for example, also mentioned in their question, Lord Hague, thank you for your insights. What might political historians say about our society in 100 years' time? And someone who says, I believe my generation is really lacking hope due to no vision for the future world and its structures. How do you envision a return to, how do you envision the future of the world's order? And there are several questions going into that direction. So perhaps one of the overall questions would be on that topic, and I'll take a couple of more questions from the room. Perhaps here in the back.
Thank you, Lord Hague, if nothing else, for giving me so many ideas for my finals papers in 3 weeks. You mentioned at the start that you'd, I hope in jest, spent 26 years looking for intelligent life in the commons. But do you think that there is a serious concern about an understanding shortage, not necessarily amongst MPs, but also in the civil service, not necessarily because there's a lack of skills, but just because things are developing so quickly and the esoteric nature of many of the technologies. I know, for example, in the pandemic, seemingly the Cabinet Office realised they had no scientists really within the civil service. Maybe there's a similar thing here. And yeah, what do you think might be done for that? And do you think maybe there's a role for AI in greater understanding? Thanks.
Would you like to respond to those
Yes.
two first, and then we go to
Yes, absolutely. Well, on that one, yes, it was a jest, by the way, about intelligent life in the House of Commons. But you're quite right. Government isn't that well equipped for the age that I've just been describing, particularly in terms of scientific and technological expertise. And, there are great new innovative ideas and startups who can take their ideas to the Ministry of Defense, and there might not be that many people there who will understand those ideas. So that does need a shake-up. Again, we have, Tony Blair and I have advocated breaking civil service pay scales urgently to bring more scientific expertise into government, and changing the conventions about ministers and saying, well, actually, you don't have to be in Parliament. We'll invent a new way for a minister to be accountable to Parliament and turn over committees and answer questions, but let's have expert ministers, particularly as junior ministers in departments, who really have the knowledge. And of course, to some extent that's happening. The appointment of Lord Valence as Science Minister, and indeed he is the sponsor minister for the Oxford-Cambridge Growth Corridor, which the government has now supported, rightly. That's good. That's because he does have the expertise, but there does need to be a bigger drive in government to achieve that. And I detect in the ministers in the current government, fairly new government, the same frustration with the process as I remember the previous ministers having. It's got harder to get things done, and the expertise to get things done isn't there. So if they're finding that, they will have to change some of the rules that I've mentioned so they've got access to the expert. And they need it. You mentioned COVID, but the country did well, and it did well partly because of Oxford and AstraZeneca. It did well because it broke the normal rules. It said, right, this is an emergency. We need a task force that takes more risks than normal, and that brings together private sector and public sector and academic expertise. Well, how about treating the state of the world as an emergency and saying we're going to do that on multiple subjects? I think that is now necessary. And on the, I suppose I asked for the questions of, now I've set out 3 chapters that people want to know, what is the next chapter? Well, that is, that of course we don't know. I would like to say that I would hope, that someone in 50 years' time, 100 years' time is writing, well, chapter 3 did go on for quite a long time. And there was a lot of instability in the 2020s and 2030s. But actually, the institutions in the United States proved strong. Many other nations learned how to cooperate closely together. Some brilliant work was done that averted some of the wars that could have happened. Of course, we want it to be a positive story. In particular, I think it might be possible to say that humans saved themselves by inventing new forms of intelligence. It's the James Lovelock theory in his, the final book he wrote when he was 99 years old, that we could only save ourselves by inventing a form of intelligence greater than our own. And that AI did bring immense benefits in energy transition and was successfully used as a form of co-intelligence. And it did bring such medical advances that actually the positive side outweighed the dangers. And, you know, in chapter 4, when chapter 4 began, it was a more settled and prosperous and a period in which truth and knowledge was again paramount. That's what I hope chapter 4 is going to say. Alternatively, there won't be anybody to write it. So we have to make sure. We have to make sure it's like the one I just described.
Well, I very much hope you're right there, and that our grandchildren and great-grandchildren will be able to read that story rather than a different version. Let's take a few more, perhaps from this side of the room, because I've prioritized this side for now. Here in the back row.
Thank you, Lord Hague. My question concerns the role or the influence of Oxford professors or academics in general. I believe in the 10 trends that you mentioned, you might not have maybe mentioned the trend in the domestic politics of all these countries, where when people are afraid, they'll gravitate towards strongmen and not necessarily professors. You know, people that are charismatic, that will just show strength, that can say, will stand up to the Trumps and the Putins of this world. And in that world, then, what is the role of an academic who then comes and speaks in academic talk and papers and tries to say all the rational things? Because all the suggestions that you said require rational people taking those actions. Someone who understands the politics also who understands the science to also discuss with someone across the table who also understands the science. So how is the university preparing us to then be relevant in such a world? Thank you.
Let's take another question and pull them. Yeah, from here.
Oliver Blake, British Army and RUSI. Lord Hague, thank you for that gallop through chapter 3. I was living in Muscat when the P5+1 negotiations were ongoing, and I'd be grateful for your thoughts on the current Iranian negotiations, perhaps sort of short and medium-term prospects, and if there's time, your reflections on the role that our Omani colleagues have played in this space for many decades.
Well, shall I take that one first, and then the one about the role of academics? Yes, Oman plays a very important role. People who have not been there or not dealt with Oman may not appreciate what a critically important friend Oman is in the world. And of course, there's a new sultan now, but the person I used to call on the head of state I used to call on most often around the world was the late Sultan of Oman. You know, the cooperation and friendship with this country is extraordinary there, but also the pivotal role played through that country having good links with Iran and with the other Gulf states and with Western countries. So it's in a key diplomatic position. It did indeed host a crucial breakthrough in those P5+1, for people who don't know the shorthand, that was the talks that we held with Iran, the UK being one of the P5 we concluded them in 2014 on what's then became, in more jargon, the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action on the Iranian nuclear program. And that was the agreement that after all that work we did to get it in place, President Trump in his first term decided to cancel. Hence, 10 years on, Iran is very, very close to having nuclear weapons. If it decided to do so, it has produced the material, very close to producing the material to do so. And now there's a new dangerous situation. I don't know what is going to happen, but it's an important question because it is the critical year on it. The combination of the Israeli military dominance that has destroyed some of Iran's allies and also destroyed many of Iran's own air defenses, leaves Iran vulnerable at the moment. The fact they're so close to their nuclear threshold also means that this is not a situation that can be ignored. And the fact that there's a one-off timing in October this year for the sanctions from Britain and Europe to so-called snap back on Iran mean that there is a window from now to October at the latest to resolve the situation with Iran. On this, I think the United States looks like it is pursuing diplomacy in a sensible way. I do worry that if it's not successful, there will be conflict, and I haven't ever seen any evidence that there is a military solution to the problem of the Iranian nuclear program. So I hope those talks succeed, is all I can say. And once again, our friends in Oman are being very, very supportive in facilitating them. So yeah, it's a really critical ally. On the role of academics and professors, well, don't be too disheartened. I mean, this is a world where truth and knowledge is going to become more, an open inquiry is going to become even more important. And yes, it is disheartening that people seem to believe more and more things that are not true at all. We have to always keep that in historical perspective. And there's never been a time where everybody knew the perfect truth. I wrote a biography of William Wilberforce, and he had a terrible time in the 1807 general election because a rumor was spread in Yorkshire there was no point voting for him because he was dead. And it was very hard in 1807, before any photographs or recording devices had been invented, to prove to people quickly that you were not dead. Well, that was fake news of the time. That was misinformation of the time. There's always been that. There have been great riots, over some of those violent riots in our histories and revolts in our histories have been because people had a complete misunderstanding and paranoia of what was going on. So to some extent, we're only reverting to a historical pattern in this period. But of course, it means we have to redouble our efforts to speak the truth as we see it, to encourage diversity of thought. And of course, it means mainstream political leaders have to find the answers themselves to those far-right movements or whatever. In fact, I've had quite a busy day because I've written my weekly article in the Times, which is probably on the website now, which is about this, looking ahead to the Canadian elections and then the local elections in the UK at the moment, where it's not beyond capable leaders to respond to this, but they will have to shake up the processes of government, as we were just talking about. They will need in international affairs to do a lot of the things that I've been describing earlier. I know it's easy for me to say this now that I've left, but it is what I think what they have to do. It's not beyond them to do it if they really get their act together, and I've set out some ideas in tomorrow morning's newspaper about how to do that. So in universities, of course, we have to be part of it. We have to be a great example of open inquiry and valuing truth and maintaining a sense of progress, and making sure those things are, wherever possible, put to good use. So we mustn't be disheartened. We have a crucial role.
We'll take a couple of more rounds of questions. I'm sure tomorrow morning everyone in this room will be reading your article, and also there are some people who already are asking for the paper that you have authored with the next forthcoming paper, not the one on AI, but the one that is expected in a couple of weeks.
Yes.
But I believe that it will be found online once it is published.
It will be published by the Tony Blair Institute and on my website, williamhague.com.
Brilliant. Yes, I will take a couple of questions here, perhaps these two first. Yeah. The mic.
Could I raise an additional dimension of this? Because there are obviously lots of ideas that can be developed by government, there's lots of ideas that can be developed in the educational sector. But to make them sustainable, one does have to have a resilient economy. You use the word resilience. And we, I think if we're realistic, we have the exact opposite of that at the moment. I mean, our government likes to talk about creating a sovereign wealth fund. We have a sovereign debt fund, and it's colossal. We have a vast government budget deficit. We're in a post-growth economy. GDP per capita has grown about 0.5% per annum this century, which is pretty close to zero. We have a rise in public sector as part of the GDP, but public sector productivity has actually fallen this century. We are dangerously self-reliant on food, and we are 50 years on from the first energy crisis, still dangerously exposed on energy. So it's very difficult to build solutions of the sort of international state unless you've got your own affairs somewhat in order. And we do seem kind of totally paralyzed on that.
That's the challenge of those mainstream politicians I was talking about earlier. Again, I've given them some advice conveniently in tomorrow's newspaper. But of course you're right. Without growth, they can't deal with these problems. And it is not in my view, impossible to create it, but it does. You know, again, I go back to all the things I've written with my old enemy, Tony Blair. We've called out a series of papers, of which this will be the sixth, a new national purpose. Because in our view, it requires a sense of a national purpose to be a leader in innovation, in AI, and other aspects of new technology. And that there's probably no other way out of the being stuck in the situation that you described. Now, we're told by many in government they've really got that point now. And so we'll see whether they can implement it. But absolutely, this is going to be extremely important. Sorry, you were going to take a group of questions, and I started answering it.
It's perfect. We have two more here. Shall we take this one first, and then Brian in the front?
Thank you. My question is slightly facetious, and I hope you're going to forgive me for it. I ask it as a dual national of this country, and as you will by now have guessed, France, as well. The question is this: do you think that General de Gaulle had a point?
Yes. Yes, General de Gaulle did have a point. However, if all Western countries, including the UK, had taken the same approach, had a Gaullist policy in the 60s and 70s, well, then I think we would have been in a worse mess. Actually, chapter 1 might not have turned out so successfully. So yeah, he had a point, but I'm sure it has been right for the United Kingdom and other European countries to stay close to the United States all of this time. And of course, a later president, Sarkozy, decided to join the full military command structure of NATO, a closer ally of the United States. It's probably been a mistake, though, and this is partly one of Trump's points, of course, to end up relying so heavily on the United States. France, at least, has maintained the full range of military-industrial capabilities, more effectively than the UK. So, yeah, there are some important insights, I think, in French policy. So, as ever in British policy, we love the French, but we also regularly differ from them.
This directly relates to one of the questions from the online audience. Axel is asking, which leading figure, past or present, in the landscape of global security do you admire the most, and why? So, imagine
the whole of the past and the present.
That's a good response as well.
There's no end date. We can go back as far as we like.
Yeah.
We're right. Okay. Well, that's easy. That's Churchill and Roosevelt. Particularly Churchill. No, it's and indeed figures who have taken a tumultuous period and arrived at a new equilibrium, helped to arrive at a new equilibrium in the world. And there are figures like that in history. And after the French Revolutionary Wars and Napoleonic Wars. The world, Europe had, and most of the world had, a very long period of peace, really akin to my chapter 2. There was quite a long period of technological progress and peace between major powers because of the wisdom with which they approached the Congress of Vienna and the treaties that after the Napoleonic Wars, a wisdom that had evaporated at the end of the First World War. So there have, again, to put it in historical perspective, been many occasions where the world was almost as disordered. They didn't have they didn't have climate change coming at them at the same time, but they had many of the other cycles going on, and they did manage to achieve a new equilibrium, despite all that. Usually after an exhausting quarter of a century. So bear that in mind.
Yes, next question from Brianna, one
Thank
of the
you.
co-hosts as well.
You've spoken about the shifting balance of power amongst nations and attendant global security challenges. Could you provide a perspective on the shifting balance of power between the state and the private sector, particularly as we approach AGI? How are governments navigating this shift? How should they? And do we need a new social contract for the AI era?
We probably do. It's going to be a hard one to write. It does threaten major changes in the balance between the citizen and the state. Very hard to forecast because it pulls in both directions, of course. I think we still don't know whether artificial intelligence is going to be the great tool of dictators, because it solves the problem dictators have always had of however powerful you are, you've not been able to keep track of everybody and what they're doing and what they're thinking, but now you can. So that is a great tool for dictators. On the other hand, it is, of course, particularly open source AI, really, is in everybody's hand. It's in the hands of the disruptor. It's in the hands of the opposition party. It's in the hands of the small country as well as the big one. So it also has a decentralizing effect, and I think this will be the coming conflict in the world between those tendencies. I think there is for governments, there are going to be very difficult choices between dictatorship and anarchy. And it is going to require great wisdom to navigate between those two things. A very good book on AI, in my view, in the last 18 months was, or 2 years, was Mustafa Suleiman's book, The Coming Wave, which really illustrates this dilemma that on multiple issues, I mentioned the importance of biotech earlier. If we get to a point where through DNA synthesis, somebody can, in their basement, create a deadly pathogen and release it into the world, well, then we will also get to the point where we have to monitor the telephone of everybody in the country to make sure they're not doing it. Heading off that problem so that you don't end up having to create an authoritarian state is going to be an important issue in the AI world. So we will need a new contract, but we're probably going to need AI to write that contract, because this is going to be quite a task. This again is why very exciting but very dangerous world.
But the outlook of a Chinese social credit system type of scheme being introduced in other authoritarian regimes is quite alarming or quite worrying. Let's take a couple of really final questions, and I think then we'll have our reception outside, and I don't want to keep anyone from the more informal conversations that will happen later on. Let's take this question here, and then also, the question here. Sorry, I'm really sorry that I can't take all the questions. I'm very happy that so many of you do have questions.
You do need a drink in the end.
Yeah.
I do, anyway.
Well, yeah, you've earned it. It was such a brilliant, concise presentation with so much insight. I'm Sam Dawes, formerly with the UN and then Foreign Office, and now working on trust building in AI governance at a time of geopolitical contention. So I'm wondering, you've met a number of UN Secretary Generals in your time. A new Secretary General will be appointed at some point next summer to start the beginning of 2027. What advice would you give them, given this crisis of multilateralism, in articulating a vision of multilateralism that it seemed to matter for large powers as well as small powers? And do you have any general advice for people like me working in the area of AI governance, given the real challenges? Are bridge states between the West and China kind of one part of the solution, or do you have any other insights from other domains that we could deploy?
Well, those are huge subjects. Do you want to get the other question?
Let's take another question. Yeah. And there was, how many questions were there here? Perhaps a third one? One more here? Yeah. Right. Brilliant.
Thank you for all your comments. I wanted to circle back on the academic freedom, free speech piece, which you've mentioned a few times. I agree it's super important. I'm curious what exactly you think universities should do to promote that, either what you're thinking at Oxford or what you would do if you were running Harvard or one of these other American universities fighting with the government.
Mm-hmm. And then just a final one here.
So one of the central pillars of the Anglo-American relationship has always been intelligence. And it seems to be, you know, I mean, we talked a little bit about the many companies and so forth that need to be built up around defense. But with intelligence, there is a particular risk, not only with, you know, having the intelligence, but also with sharing it potentially with a, you know, a friend who may be an enemy. And there are reasons to maybe not trust some of the people in the US administration. So I wondered what you might suggest on this. Do you think that it's there is a realistic possibility of independence in this area, or how can this be managed, this problem?
Well, you've put your finger on, if I take those in reverse order, you've put your finger on a bigger problem. I mentioned, just to illustrate how big the problem is of trying not to be integrated with the United States, the nuclear weapons. But actually, intelligence is an even better example, because we are hardwired together in many ways, particularly in signals intelligence. You know, and that's the bulk of intelligence, really. And you know, we have the Five Eyes network, and then within the Five Eyes, there's very close US-UK cooperation. So as Foreign Secretary, I would visit facilities in the United States which no foreign minister of any other country in the world would be able to visit. It is that intimate a relationship. I think it's important institutionally to try to hang on to that, and of course you have to hope that things change in the United States. But that is such an enduring relationship all the way back to Bletchley Park. You know, and both countries benefit so much from it, because the UK is really the biggest beneficiary from it, but both benefit so much from it. It's important to hang on to that, whether you end up with some sort of subcategory of intelligence. It's an almost revolutionary thought in British government that you end up with intelligence you don't share with the United States, and vice versa. I don't know. I can see that happening, but it's going to be. I suppose it's important at this point to say, while we have to adapt to this world in so many ways, we mustn't give up on all the people in the United States who are horrified by what is happening. So yes, there may have to be all sorts of add-ons and experiments in intelligence, but that's a pretty priceless asset we have in the cooperation with the United States. We're still in the United States, academic freedom. Yeah, I think it's important. I think it was a good statement by Harvard last week. I think it's important to take on, for those universities to take on the threats to them, you know, and fight on the principles of it. And then I think it will be important to keep developing in new ways academic freedom and freedom of speech. Because I mentioned it, we can all fall into orthodoxies and ideologies and, you know, fashionable ways of thinking, and lack political diversity ourselves sometimes. So I sometimes feel, even in Oxford, sometimes you have to sort of create a debate. You know, it's okay to differ, with respect to other people, of course, and in a spirit of inquiry, not of anger and confrontation. You know, it perhaps what's happening in the United States. It's important not to give people an excuse to do that sort of thing, and to really always be able to show that new ideas, and that there's always challenge, that new ideas are always coming through the academic world. There's a plentiful supply of them, but we could debate them more. That would be my advice on that. And as for, and now I'm advising the next UN Secretary General, apparently. Well, it's largely everything I've said already, but particularly, though, to keep those multilateral institutions and hopes alive. You know, just because it's impossible to negotiate an outer space treaty now, or a new non-proliferation treaty now, doesn't mean it's impossible in 15 years' time. Maybe we will get into a better chapter 4. And if the United Nations stands for anything, it has to keep the hopes of those things alive, and it has to make sure nations are still working together across their ideological divides. So I think and I actually feel, in the age of social media and such rapid communication to billions of people around the world, the next UN Secretary General, all the ones I've known have been very accomplished, capable people, but they are going to have to be a global communicator to an unprecedented extent, rather than just a diplomat. They are going to have to be able to reach the normal person on every continent of the world. And so I think that's a particularly demanding position coming up. And on AI governance, well, again, we've discussed many aspects of that, but I think the crucial thing about AI, and it relates to the question of is it going to, how it will change the balance of state and citizen, is in so many aspects of how we use AI, we are going to be deciding whether it makes us more human or less human. It can, of course, used as a co-intelligence, used as a way of giving us more leisure time, used as a way of inventing new medicines that allow us to have a longer, healthier life. That is all allowing us to be more human. But if we end up forming our personal relationships with AI rather than with people, well, actually, we're going to end up less human, as well as very anxious, very stressed, very depressed, and very rebellious. So it's not really the answer to your question, but I think it is that question about what is Chapter 4 will very heavily depend on whether artificial intelligence gives us more space to be human or reduces us to being the data processing units of artificial intelligence software. That is what we have to make sure life is exuberantly human. And a good form of that is having a drink together.
I think that's a brilliant ending. Thank you so much.